This morning's sermon title is Hurt People, Hurt People. Anne read for us the beginning of the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis, and in some ways, the book of Genesis is all about this. The book of Genesis is full of origin stories that are sacred to both Jews and Christians. In Genesis, we find two stories of creation of the cosmos and of our world. There's also the story of how humans lost access to the garden of blissful ignorance. In Genesis, we also find stories of how envy, jealousy, and violence first entered into human culture. All of this in just the first few chapters. Later, there's the story of Abraham and how the Israelites and Ishmaelites came into being, those feuding brothers, with the birth of the sons of Abraham. But Genesis doesn't tell the whole story. Genesis highlights the descendants of Isaac while almost completely writing out the descendants of Ishmael. Genesis focuses on Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau, Jacob, the one who later becomes Israel. And it focuses on that family's internal power struggle, complete with all the deceit and betrayal, and then the reconciliation. All throughout the book of origins we know as Genesis, there are stories of conflict and violence. As we read these stories, we can't help but begin to notice that systems that privilege some and ignore or suppress others are woven into the very fabric of the culture of our ancestors in faith from the very beginning. Our reading today is the beginning of the story of Jacob's sons. But before this story begins, let me give you a little context. We have to understand that Jacob has become very prosperous. He has a very large family, many wives, many animals, many sons to help care for his flocks. But all isn't well within his family. Jacob's sons actually know the story of what their father did to his own brother. They know how their father pulled the wool over his father's eyes and tricked him into giving a large share of his wealth to Jacob, even though Jacob wasn't the oldest son and wasn't supposed to get the largest share. Yes, Jacob's sons are aware of this family story, and they're always on edge, watching out for threats coming from their younger siblings. They clearly don't trust each other. At the time of this story, Jacob is old, and he depends on his sons that he doesn't entirely trust either. But he depends on them to preserve the family wealth. And Jacob does have a favorite son, which pretty naturally is his youngest son. It's the son of his favorite wife, Rachel. His favorite wife, not Rachel. But Joseph gets special gifts and privileges. He's also used by his father as a snitch to inform on his brothers. No wonder his brothers hate Joseph. They hate him even more because he claims to have these dreams that he arrogantly shares in front of the whole family. Dreams in which he, the youngest, is lording it over the rest of the family. Now, dreams in those days were considered to be communications from God, from the divine. So Joseph having these kinds of dreams was just maddening to his brothers. Jealousy and envy are on display as the brothers hear that Joseph is coming out after them where they're grazing the flocks. And so they plot against him. to neutralize this bratty brother. But their plotting is no joke, coming from this band of brothers. For a little context, if we look back in Genesis a few chapters to chapter 34, we find this group of brothers taking revenge on a neighboring tribe for the rape of their sister Dinah. They deceive and murder the entire clan to get even. Now, this is a traumatic episode in the Bible that we don't often hear about. It's pretty bloody. But it gives some weight to the threats that these brothers are hatching against Joseph. Although it was not recognized as a thing back in biblical times, we can imagine that the brothers' violent past would have left them with some degree of what we might now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And hurt people tend to hurt people. So when the brothers propose murdering Joseph, they have to be taken seriously. Resma Menakem, a practicing therapist who specializes in embodied trauma, would say that this band of brothers is living with decontextualized trauma. The trauma is in the past. They're not acting out of it currently. But he goes on to say that trauma decontextualized in a family begins to look like family traits. And so these siblings begin to look like gangsters. In our story today, though, not all the brothers share that gangster trait to an equal degree. There is one brother who seems to have held on to something like compassion. And that brother is Reuben. Reuben uses his deviousness to plot to save Joseph's life. He talks his brothers into throwing Joseph down the well rather than just outright killing him. He convinces them to leave Joseph there, knowing that he will surely die of exposure and starvation. But secretly, Reuben plans to return and rescue Joseph. What Reuben doesn't count on is that greed will foil his rescue plans. The siblings notice a caravan of traders trekking to Egypt, and they offer to sell Joseph, and a deal is struck. The traders quickly pull Joseph out of the well and carry him off into slavery. Well, the brothers, now with money in their pockets, go forward with the plan that they hatched of putting some blood on Joseph's special coat, the coat that was given to him by his father, and telling their father that he was killed by a wild animal and he won't be returning. Our reading ends today in the middle of the whole story that's in the Bible about Joseph. I don't know about you, but one way that I learned to make sense of the Bible is to ask, where in this story do we see things similar playing out in our own lives, in our families, in our neighborhoods and cities, and in our country? Well, it's easy to imagine that we see the long and painful history of brutality playing out from Genesis coming forward, playing out in the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, in the tear gassing and brutally dispersing of peaceful protesters, but even in the murders that occur among gangs in our cities. If this is a story about how we got to be the way we are, it's a very cynical and depressing assessment. It's one that reinforces one of the early Christian theologians, Augustine's view that humans are totally depraved. But I'm going to try to inject a bit of hope through the back door by looking at this story with a modern angle, looking at it through the lens of trauma psychology. everyone knows, right? That hurt people hurt people. We see traumatized people inflicting yet more trauma on each other every day. Murder rates are increasing almost everywhere in the country. I keep listening back to my former hometown, Chicago, and hearing that there have been more children under 10 shot and killed in that city than there have been in 10 years in the last 6 months. That's not very hopeful. So now what? Well, another way I was taught to read a biblical story was to ask, with whom in the story do I identify? Where do I see myself? Well, I can see myself easily in Reuben. He stands out as exhibiting some compassion. Reuben also knows that in order to avoid becoming the target of his brother's wrath, he hides his intentions from them. It occurs to me when I reflect on this story and our present time that Reuben's intentions to save his brothers are like my own. To be a white ally in the struggle for justice for Black lives. To right the wrongs inflicted on my brothers and sisters of color. I intend well, but what difference do I really make? As one person, I mean. I'm often foiled in my attempts by evil siblings, by bad cops, by racist, fascist authorities. I lack the courage and perseverance to continue fighting for justice when more powerful forces come against me, or when Congress refuses to act to control guns. It's just more comfortable for me to fall in line with the powers that be than to try and continue fighting the abuse that goes on. Well, that's not very hopeful either. What else can we see here in this story? We have to maybe go beyond where we ended in the Bible reading today. As the story of Joseph continues beyond that part, we know that he gets to Egypt and he becomes a slave to Potiphar, but his ability to interpret dreams gets him noticed by Pharaoh. And ultimately, Joseph interprets one of Pharaoh's really bad dreams, leading to Joseph making a recommendation for the good stewardship of Egypt's agricultural bounty. And as a result, Joseph gets elevated to a position of great power in Pharaoh's government. And then he ultimately gets an opportunity to help his family. They show up on his doorstep when famine sweeps through their country. Now, if you've ever seen the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, you know that Joseph becomes the hero in the end. But we may not know, or we may have forgotten, that Joseph helping his family get into Egypt and saving their life back then, his good deed on behalf of his family, ushers the children of Israel into slavery in Egypt. And they languish there for 400 years before Moses rises up as a leader and leads them to freedom. More violence, more oppression. Is there anything here to pin hope on? I come back to what Resmaa Menakem says about trauma. Reading the text with Resmaa Menakem as a guide, him shining the light of embodied trauma on the family of Jacob, we can imagine or assume that Joseph and his brothers are all operating within a family pattern of trauma. Trauma that has not been addressed. Trauma that has become disconnected from the events that gave rise to it. Trauma that gets passed on because it isn't addressed. What Anne read to us today from Menakem's work says trauma decontextualized in a person starts to look like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family starts to look like family traits. Trauma in a whole people starts to look like culture. Jacob's sons, including Joseph, are stuck with the family trait of envy, jealousy, deceit, and desire for revenge. They're all there in all the brothers, including Joseph. So Joseph is ready to be triggered despite his miraculous rise to power in the Egyptian government. When Joseph sees his family coming to ask him for help in Egypt, he has at that moment the power of a fairy godmother to change his family's fortunes, but he has never healed his past trauma. And he doesn't see that. So when he first meets them, what rises up in him is embodied trauma. Joseph's body remembers very well that his brothers threw him in a well and sold him into slavery. And his body is ready to inflict pain on them. So while he up here wants to welcome them, his body doesn't trust them. So without knowing where it comes from, Joseph threatens them. He says, "You bring your father here." And they say, okay, we'll bring our father. You're going to help us, right? And Joseph says, but I want to keep one of your brothers here as hostage to make sure you're going to return with your father. I want Benjamin. He's the baby that's been born. Joseph is thinking, he's the baby who's now dad's favorite. And if I send my brothers back without Benjamin, dad's going to kill him. Joseph's brothers are terrified, and they negotiate to win a concession. And an older brother volunteers to stay behind instead of Benjamin. Ultimately, the sons of Jacob do return. But when they return with Jacob, they walk into a trap. The trap, a soft trap, springs behind them, and that results in their descendants living as an exploited underclass in Egypt until Moses encounters a burning bush and leads his people out some 400 years later. So that's the long story of how hurt people hurt people. Trauma in people begins to look like culture. Jacob's family in Egypt begins to look like an underclass with all the trauma embodied. Their health outcomes are worse. Their life expectancy is less. Culture gets handed down through the bodies, and culture gets handed down through the stories we tell. Trauma keeps getting passed on generation to generation until it's everywhere human beings are. It's everywhere now, in the Middle East, in Europe, in the Americas, all over the globe. It played out when white explorers and settlers arrived here on this, what we call the North American continent, craving a place where they could live their life without being exploited, oppressed, and brutalized by systems in Europe. They arrived with trauma held in their bodies, and then they proceeded to push that trauma onto other bodies, indigenous bodies, Black African bodies, even other white bodies, without ever having exposed it to the healing light and grace of the God that they professed. Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, lays out a thesis that because white people haven't done their own work of becoming aware of the trauma that they swim in, like water, we continue to inflict traumatic injury on people of color who are less powerful. We can see it in slavery, followed by Jim Crow, becoming embodied in our legal systems, getting decontextualized as we fail to tell the stories of how these things came to be, because we're ashamed of those stories. It became the water we swim in that allows us to say, I'm not racist, while the system keeps inflicting harm. It becomes the water that allows us to remain comfortable while turning up the heat on people of color with our justice system, among other things. This isn't easy to talk about. The current protests centering the Black Lives Matter movement looks right now like an opportunity for things to begin to crack open and change. But Resmaa Menakem is skeptical. He's skeptical about whether this current movement will result in any lasting systemic change unless we white folks do some serious work on our own embodied but decontextualized trauma. Menakem offers this advice to those who really want to be allies in this struggle. He says, what I feel is the most important thing is that white bodies have to begin to get into a room with each other, then to deal with the uncomfortableness, deal with the hierarchy that starts to show up, deal with all the brutality that starts to happen with each other's bodies, and then figure out how they're going to develop culture all around beginning to heal over time. His description sounds like Jacob's sons, doesn't it? When they get in a room, they start to have hierarchy and they start to develop violent schemes. Well, Resmaa Menakem says that if we took on this project, it could take 3 years, maybe 10 years of working, starting on our individual selves and moving outward. And if we're willing to put in the time, he says, we might begin to develop a culture that leads to healing and wholeness, and then to equity and justice in our society. It's important to get that trauma is not the mark of Cain. It's not something that just happens to bad people or soldiers or particular groups of people. This is universal. Another trauma therapist named Peter Levine says that trauma is inescapable. Trauma unites the world. No one gets through life without experiencing it. But just because it's universal doesn't mean that we deal with it well. We can't ignore it and hope it will heal by itself. We know that it won't. It hasn't so far. We all need to do our work individually and together as a group of people in releasing it and healing it. So that brings me around to another way of reading scripture. Another way is to look for where God is in the text. This one might get us somewhere, to see what God is up to. This story of Joseph and his brothers leaves us holding our breath, waiting for God to do God's liberating work. The Israelites are in Egypt for 400 years. Slavery and Jim Crow have existed in our country for 400 years. I've heard a lot of people say, we need a leader. We need a leader to emerge. A leader who'll take us where we need to go. I don't think we can wait for that leader to emerge. I think we have to be the leaders we hope will emerge. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think if we look where spirit is right now, it's in multiple movements. I believe the energy of God's Spirit is calling us and empowering us from all directions to take our parts in changing the culture that has led to so much trauma for so many. One place we can start is here, looking anew at our foundational stories, stories like the story of Joseph and Jacob, and seeing how fraught they are with brutality and exploitation. And we can reject that behavior as an inevitability. If we don't shy away from that work, then we can delve deeply into the hidden histories of our state, Oregon, and of our country. This is what we have to do if we're going to build the beloved community. Another trauma therapist, Thomas Hübl, who's a modern mystic, calls this thing we're dealing with right now the cultural shadows. Deep in the shadows of the past, Grant. Thank you. We have to begin to look into those shadows. We have to be able to see what's there and feel its impact in our own bodies, and then begin to heal it here before we begin to heal it out there. It will not be easy, and it will most certainly be uncomfortable. But we must create a new story of the beloved community, and we have to do it together. May God be with us as we work together. Amen.